Hey, deserving listeners, this is Chapter 8 in our deep dive on the Duggars. Let's get to it. My name is Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor.
My name is Humberto Castañeda. I try weird sushi.
So let's go to our timeline. 2009, we already went over that the family started to go on the Christian speaker circuit about the quiverful movement, at the very least, or just general Christian values, that sort of thing.
And we were talking about last time how a lot of the emphasis was on the message they wanted to send was on really enjoying the time you have with your children and really spending that quality time and enjoying all your children. And I was making a point, which led us down a tangent, of how hard it must be to make that point when you have to divide your attention among 19 children. So it's like, enjoy the time you have with your children is hampered when you have 19 children.
Yeah, enjoy the time with your children and make sure you have constant pregnancies and more children so that you have even less time with all of your children. Yeah. Now, can you have a lot of kids in a family and have it go well for the children, have the children be raised to be happy and healthy? Yes, but it can be a factor in leading to lack of attunement for children, but it can be mitigated by making sure there's grandparents and cousins and older siblings, as long as it's appropriate. You're not parенtifying. Anyway, so 2010, they are getting more popular. 2011, they publish a second book that is very popular. Now, we want to raise the question again, was Josh continuing to abuse children during this time? We don't know. There's no evidence of that, but it is a question. At some point around here, Josh is married to Anne. He's starting to have kids. He's absolutely following in the parents' footsteps with IBLP, their cult, and also with the quiverful movement, that aspect of the cult of making sure you're having lots of kids and arguably keeping women down. And it's explicit in the hierarchical structure of this cult that men are in charge of everything. And so Josh is around 21 at this point, and he's starting to rise within politics, as is dictated by this religious cult that you're supposed to. The quiverful movement is to have lots of arrows in your quiver so that you can use your children as ammunition against the oncoming tide of the evil secular world, essentially. And so Josh is a conservative right-wing. Wouldn't it be weird if he was a progressive liberal or something?
Actually, I could kind of see an angle of, well, no, but then because you wouldn't want that many people in the world, but you could see like, well, wait, they're overpopulating over us. Now we gotta put more kids so we can vote liberal. I could see it from that angle, not necessarily the religious angle, but yeah.
Yeah. So he is a conservative right-wing politician, just like his parents were, particularly his dad, which means that he's explicitly, and there are lots of clips of him being explicitly against gay people, against trans people, against abortion. You know the conservative right-wing rhetoric, and it's awful. I don't understand. So I always just think, have you read a history book? Because when, I would imagine that even conservative right-wing politicians and right-wing people, when they look back at certain bigotry moments in history, like Jim Crow laws, this kind of thing, or the Civil War, I would hope, or slavery in general, let's just say, that I would hope that they would see the good guys as the ones that were fighting against those oppressive systems.
Right. I mean, it depends how far to that section you are, because even nowadays there are people trying to justify it and saying there were good things to learn in the Holocaust.
Right. The average conservative right wing, I would imagine that when they look at things, or when they hear about the Third Reich killing Jewish people, killing gay people, that I would like to think that I would imagine that they would say, well, yeah, I mean, no, that's not okay.
Right.
And yet they have the rhetoric that is completely in line with the rhetoric of those times. You could say it's not as bad because they're not marching them in the gas chambers, but it's the same lines, the same justifications, the same statements and bullet points that they use. And you just think that they would learn from history and say like, maybe in 20 years, even people from my side of the aisle will look back at me and think that I was in the wrong because I'm just against a whole class of individuals and I don't want them to have rights. Like maybe there's a red flag there, you just think. But
it doesn't seem to me like humans, all of us, are very good at caring about 20 years from now.
Yeah, as evidenced by climate change. Anyway, I'm sure that's a whole other aspect of Josh's politics as well, being anti-acknowledgement of the consensus of science. So Josh Duggar is rising in politics. He's doing the lobbying. There's that organization for the cult of IBLP that is organizing in Washington, D.C.,
right.
sending a lot of talented lobbyists and well-funded individuals to enter politics or influence politics. They could have influenced all sorts of things.
By the way, when I watched the documentary, because again, I've been throughout my life, especially when I was younger, I'd been exposed to evangelical, big church congregations, folks that ask for money every chance they get, all these things. But when I saw the documentary, I didn't realize the scale of what their plan was for this group.
Yeah.
Of infiltrating throughout the world in government and politics and everything.
Yeah. I mean, it's now
is. I mean, I said was, is.
It's normal for political groups in all areas to organize and lobby. For example, there are lobbyists lobbying for things that we would agree with in Washington, D.C. So it's not like they're the only ones doing it. But yeah, it really looked like this, this assembly line of like, have kids, check, have as many as possible, check, indoctrinate them with this system, make sure they're homeschooled so they have no outside influence, check, make sure they're absolute cult brainwashed, check, then basically compel them to dedicate their life to changing politics and policy.
And give them systems and money to do so.
Yeah.
Because so you were asking like, this is why it would be so hard, or it is so hard to counteract this, because a lot of folks on the progressive side or left side, they don't have such systems and organization. And
no, we do. There are progressive organizations that
indoctrinate children and train them with money and like almost like step by step how to get to Congress and lobby. No,
right. No. Not that level.
No, and that we're having tons of kids to flood the gates with. No.
Right, quite the opposite actually.
Yeah. Exactly.
Progressive, educated people tend to have fewer children. Yeah.
and to the point where a lot of it is about free thinking. So even on the left, you end up having so many nuanced different positions. Like, well, I do think plastic bottles should be okay. Well, I don't think plastic bottles should be okay. Whereas on that side, like in that movement, it's the homogeneity of thinking is an important value. We got to believe the same thing.
Yeah.
And it's very powerful when you do that, even though it's dangerous.
Right, because there's no wiggle room.
Right.
I think because if they allow wiggle room, then it falls apart because there's not a lot of logic to it. It's all based on this kind of narrow interpretation of the Bible, which not every Christian shares. This
is why when you watch the debate the other night, which I watched part of, the Republican, like the positions are almost all the same. So they have to tweak just how outrageous the extreme position is. It's like, well, fine, I'll go a little over what you just said.
Yeah, I heard, I don't know, you tell me, that they were asked to publicly declare whether or not they agreed that with the consensus of 99% of climate scientists and other scientists that climate change is at least in part caused by humans, and they all declared that they did not believe that to be true.
Well, not only did no one declare that they believed it, it got derailed by one of them, DeSantis, because he was like, well, don't treat us like children. Let's have the debate. Of course, they proceeded to have no debate.
Yeah. And the thing is, and we'll very briefly, we got to get back to the timeline, but they created a monster because I'm quite sure that most, if not all of those politicians totally understand the science because they are educated, these individuals, and they probably have all the information.
Yeah.
But because they've brainwashed the voting populace otherwise,
they can't react backwards now.
They can't recant it because they will not be voted into office.
Right.
They have to appease the monster that they've created because for decades they've been pumping the public with brainwashed material because there was so much money from the energy companies and other sorts of people that benefit from the ignorance of climate change. They were funding all of these politicians and continue to, by the way. And so they created this monster that they can't back down from. And meanwhile, we're just going off of the edge of the cliff. Yeah. So good for you. Anyway, so getting back to the timeline, 2012, they are even more famous. 2013, even more famous.
Just
the reason why I'm going through
the show's getting popularity.
Yeah, and all of them, even outside of the show. And the reason why I'm pointing this out is because we know what we know now about Josh Duggar and the victims and the family, and very few people knew about it or paid attention to it. It was made public kind of when the police investigated after the Oprah show was notified by someone in the church that Josh Duggar had abused younger kids. But it was basically just online forums that were trying to raise awareness about it. There wasn't a huge, it's sort of like with the Me Too movement. A lot of the reckoning that happened to some of these folks, the victims had been coming forward for decades in some cases, like Harvey Weinstein, these sort of folks. And it just hadn't reached a critical mass to make it newsworthy enough to push it over into a zone where people started to, where, the average American or average consumer was actually looking at it.
And then people go like, why did you wait so long to bring it up?
Right.
We didn't.
Yeah. It's been out there for the whole time, but people swept it under the rug. So 2014, they write another book, Growing Up Duggar, but it's officially written by 4 of the daughters, Jana, Jill, Jessa, and Ginger. And it's called Growing Up Duggar. And the book, I read excerpts and summaries. You could argue, especially given the context of the homeschooling and the cult nature of this context, that the book is just propaganda for the cult.
Sure.
It's super positive about their church and the family. And, okay, maybe a lot of their experiences were positive, but it's really positive about their weird rules and systems. There's some complaining by the kids in the books, but it is, it's framed in a way of just like, well, you can't have it all, or there's not something fundamentally rotten at the core. Yeah. It's just, I don't like responsibility sometimes, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And by the way, the kids, from what I can tell, aside from the one that was interviewed in the documentary, they've all retained this point of view, even beyond the scandals that we're going to get into, including the one that's in the documentary. Like in the documentary, I think is it Jill, I believe, which we'll get into in a second.
They haven't abandoned the church, right?
Right. They're still totally conservative, right-wing members. They just are distancing themselves from the Duggar franchise, so to speak.
Yeah.
But anyway, so 2014, Josie Duggar has the seizure on camera, and we talked about that in a previous episode. Also in 2014, Bill Gothard is fired. So the organization had been receiving reports of him and his brother sexually harassing women and girls, at least 34 women. We'll get into this more later when we get into the specifics of the religion, but just to put it in perspective. So 2015, okay, so this is when...
And by the way, I'm sure that was huge news, right? It was reported.
No, not at all. It was just completely swept under, at least...
But they talked about it on the show. The head of our church...
Yeah. The person that we worship, that we consider to be our prophet on this planet.
And full disclosure, something along these lines happened in our own family, which I wonder if there's some sort of systemic rot.
Even if they had, TLC, the producers, would have edited it out because they were making money and that's all that matters. So in 2015, this is when the scandals really hit the fan. So this is when the police reports are published by In Touch magazine. So In Touch magazine published that 2006 police report. So remember that the family went to that one police officer who just slapped Josh on the wrist.
And there was no report from that.
Yeah, there was no, at least a reported report. But the police officer later would be convicted and jailed twice for child pornography. But then when the Oprah team had heard about the allegations, they contacted people that contacted the police, and the police actually investigated 2006 because of statute of limitations. Nothing happened. We don't know the specifics. Was CPS involved? Were they not? Seemingly nothing happened to Josh at all after the investigation from the police. But there were interviews and there were reports made by victims and maybe by Josh himself. And In Touch magazine gets their hands on these and publishes them in 2006 or in 2015. So this is 9 years later, and after 8 years of the show being on hugely famous. And I'm just trying to imagine what In Touch magazine was thinking, like, why then? Because this is before Me Too, right?
Yeah.
Because it would seem like it would sort of coincide, but
huge news because, first of all,
but why not earlier? Why not like 2010? Like why 2015 exactly?
Oh, wait a minute. Are you saying that they had the data years before?
The data was out there. It's not like, I don't know the circumstances, but I don't know how you get your hands on police reports.
Sometimes it's like an enterprising reporter's like, wait, what?
Right. That's what I'm guessing. It's just like someone was like, well, I don't have anything else to do. Or maybe they had a bone to pick themselves or something. But at any rate, it comes out finally in 2015. And it could have been swept under the rug by society, but for whatever reason, people actually started paying attention to it.
Well, it's kids. It's not just like women making allegations, which was the harder part of the initial Me Too. This was like, it's kids being abused.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. There's still victim shaming.
Yeah.
But maybe not at the level that women experience when they come forward being harassed at work, that kind of stuff. So
and these circuses work two ways. They were kind of the circus freak show initially presented as such and when people feel like there's drama in those kinds of circuses, they want that drama too. So there's that aspect as well.
Right. So there's a media circus at how popular and awesome they are. And then as soon as they turn a corner, there's a huge media circus about how awful they are. Right. That's the consequence of fame. So there's a huge media circus. The public finally turns the corner on them. And to those people on the forums that have been talking about these,
like, yes,
finally we're actually, after years and years, just years and years after the fact, they're finally getting vindication. And the parents began a public relations campaign. Now, you could argue TLC could have been behind it as well, because they stood to lose a lot by having one of their flagship shows be attacked in this way. And maybe even you could imagine TLC thinking, we could capitalize on this. If we can get the family to be likable at least enough, then we could think about the ratings that people will tune in to watch the show. So who knows what the motivation was, but at least the parents went on a public relations campaign. And Josh issued an exclusive statement to People magazine. He was 27 years old at the time of this report. And he says, quote, 12 years ago, as a young teenager, I acted inexcusably.
Wait, 12 years ago?
Yeah, it was when he was 14-ish.
Okay, 14, 15.
So that is when he stepped forward to his parents and told them that he had been abusing the younger siblings. And according to the story anyway, he didn't do anything after that point. He had told the family friends that he had been abusing the girls for years, from the ages of 2 to 5. So he says in People, 12 years ago, as a young teenager, I acted inexcusably, for which I am extremely sorry and deeply regret. I hurt others, including my family and close friends. So just chiming in here, it's possible that he's just saying this and lying. I'm assuming a lot of people would assume that. But it's also possible he's telling the truth. There are people out there. In fact, the majority of people who abuse children in this way do have empathy in their heart, do have compassion. There are those who don't, but there are, most of them have at least the capacity. They often will, if they are left untreated, develop a pretty robust justification for abusing the children, because they're having cognitive dissonance around their impulses and their efforts to preserve self-esteem and the idea that they're a good person. So when you have that cognitive dissonance, something's got to give.
Oh, the child was too young to remember, or they were old enough to know what was going on, or whatever.
They liked it. They wanted it, or that sort of thing. So yeah, there are justifications. And for psychopaths, people who don't have empathy, they will say those things as well. But even for those who do have the capacity for empathy, left to their own devices, we will go into denial about all sorts of things. It doesn't take a psychopath to go into denial about things. So it's hard to know we just don't know what's going on with Josh.
Yeah.
There's evidence either way, and mostly there's just a lack of evidence, because I've treated people in this situation, not only perpetrators, and certainly a lot of victims, but also families. And I can tell you that when I have a lot of data and I actually have access to the Joshes of the world, it's still unclear because you can't really know what's in someone's heart. So it's hard to know.
It's also possible, like if I were the church elders, again, I'm not condoning this is what you should do or whatever, that you should only go to your church elders. But if I were the church elders, I would have probably had a ridiculously serious conversation with Josh about what he was putting at risk. He was not only putting at risk his family's honor, the show, but bigger than that, he was putting at risk the whole religion and the whole movement, right? Because he was an icon, a figurehead. So
yeah,
maybe...
But I bet you the conversations from the elders was about God and Jesus and was saying, you are condemned by God and Jesus if you continue to do this thing and you will go to hell. There was, I'm probably undoubtedly conversations along those lines.
Yes, granted.
In fact, I would guess 90%, just my guess is 90% of the conversation was along those lines because that's usually the way it's framed,
Yeah, maybe I'm more cynical because I feel like that would have been like to start with, you realize if you keep doing this, you're going to go to hell. But now, the more important matter, do you realize what you're putting at risk here?
Well, the motivation behind the elders could have been what you're talking about, but the message could have been, because it's probably a lot more motivating to a cult member that you're going to hell when you literally believe in eternal damnation and torture than it is to talk about economics or an organizational longevity. You know what I mean?
I wonder, like, having been in these organizations, not those kinds, but similar ones, like, not, anyways, part of the Catholic Church, a school that was a Catholic school. I oftentimes when I was being disciplined, or I don't remember being disciplined hearing about the risk I was having to my soul.
Are you saying that when you're in Catholic school in Colombia and you're being disciplined, they're saying, don't make Catholics look bad? Do you think
No. I'm just saying it was a way more mundane. It was like, you're going to get in trouble. We're going to send a letter. You're dead. Never it was like, think about your soul. Think about how Jesus would be.
Well,
I don't remember any of that.
I imagine, given what I know about these sort of evangelical Christians and more specifically IBLP Christians, that it is very much this black and white situation of, are you going to spend your life in eternal damnation or in the glory of God?
I'm not denying. Of course, that was definitely part of the conversation. And you're right. The motivation might have been what triggered it. I also think they could have literally been like, because remember, I was saying how in the YouTube channel I watched,
14-year-old, you know what I mean? Like, because he's when they're chastising 14, Josh, he's 14. That's when they're really going after him.
It could have been throughout or something.
It just seems like above his head when he's 14. You know what I mean? But maybe they did.
Well, because the YouTubers I was watching, there were two dudes that were part of that church. They were talking about how they would have been kicked out of the movement, of the church, kicked out from their perspective, from talking in a room by themselves with a woman.
Yeah.
Right? But none of that conversation was about the risk to their soul. It was about kicked out of the church.
But that is a risk to their soul because, and that was talked about by the members in the documentary and other podcasts that I've listened to, that it was explicitly told, and there's a lot of implicit messaging, that if you are excommunicated from this cult, you are going to hell. There's, in fact, you're definitely going to hell because you had a chance. If there's a member outside of the cult that's never had a chance, then maybe God will have some mercy, but you had a chance and you squandered it. You're definitely going to hell. That's how cults operate. They're much worse to ex-members than to non-members. You know what I mean?
If the threat of hell worked that effectively, always, think of how many problems we wouldn't have had.
Well, the other implication is no one will talk to you. All of your friends will hate you. You'll have to have no support.
That's what I'm getting at. I think that there were probably both angles because the threat of hell is always there. When you're growing up in these religions, you're always aware that, oh my gosh. I think I mentioned that for a lot of my youth, I kept thinking in my head, my dad's going to hell. How can I prevent this? Because he's an atheist, right? So, yeah.
Yeah. So going on, he says, I confess this to my parents who took several steps to help me address the situation. We spoke with the authorities where I confessed my wrongdoings, and my parents arranged for me and those affected by my actions to receive counseling. Now, from reports, the quote-unquote counseling was by the church, by headquarters, by the administration of, IBLP, their cult. So I'm just going to take a guess and say it wasn't specialized, competent perpetrator treatment.
Did the victims receive counseling?
I mean, he says so, and I don't doubt that. I don't doubt that the kids did talk to elders or something.
Okay.
And maybe it did help. We don't know, but I'm take a guess and say that it wasn't sufficient.
Given some of the other accounts about how the temptation is the woman's fault.
Yeah, right. Right.
And
exactly.
those conversations might have been like, so what did you do?
What were you wearing?
Yeah.
At the
what
age
kind
of
of
at the age
diaper
of-
did you have?
Yeah, exactly. Going on. I sought forgiveness from those I had wronged and asked Christ to forgive me and come into my life. I would do anything to go back to those teen years and take different actions. End of quote. So, it's quite possible that he's telling the truth here. There's nothing deceptive about what he's saying. He might even literally believe, and maybe it's even partially true, that the quote-unquote counseling that he received did help him to stop this behavior. It's also possible that he originally reached out and confessed to his parents and to the police and to the family friends and to the church because he actually didn't want to do this anymore because he was concerned about it. Doesn't let him off the hook for doing the behaviors for several years, but we also don't know where this behavior comes from. Was he victimized himself? Was he modeled something? At the very least, we speculated that due to the insular cult environment and the overemphasis on sexuality and repressing it can screw up a young child's mind. These cults, as we've talked about earlier, they purport to be very pure and they want to relegate sex to procreation and marriage. But as a result, they have to constantly talk about sex to constantly suppress from various angles, including misogynistic angles, to blame girls and make sure that they're being pure and dressing a certain way and not tempting the male sexuality. But in addition to that, just all sorts of talk about how sex needs to be postponed, how you're not supposed to masturbate, how you're not supposed to fantasize, or pornography is wrong, and the rest of society is wrong, and MTV is wrong, and Kim Kardashian is wrong. Everyone's going to hell, and music is wrong. That lyric is sexually innuendo-ish, and so that's of the devil. It's just this constant, because
that's the most important thing.
It's just constant.
All about it.
Yeah, because you have to put in so much effort to prevent 17-year-olds from masturbating or having sex or at the very least making out with someone. Like, it's a biological urge that most people have, and if you're trying to suppress that, you've got to have all hands on deck. And I think as a result, you end up basically, in a way, sexually abusing the children by one, at the very least, shaming them for having a normal human impulse, and two, just by constantly talking about sexuality in this very distorted, odd way. So could someone who's raised in that environment have an emerging sexuality at the age of 12, 13, 14, and be very confused and conflicted about what they're experiencing and suppressing and hating themselves, having nowhere to turn, and they're homeschooled, they don't have a contact with peers, you're not even allowed to talk to girls your own age, and might you end up expressing urges towards your siblings and maybe targeting even younger siblings because they're less likely to fight back or something? Was he potentially not going to develop pedophilia and sexual attraction to minors if he was raised in a regular American family? Hard to know. Was he victimized himself? Hard to know. But it's just, I don't know. There's also a million other factors that I don't know about that could be present, but it just is a topic that I think should be discussed.
Just as a human experiment, you put an envelope in a room, and you're like, do not open this envelope. I'll be gone for a few hours. Do not open this envelope. I mean,
yeah. Yeah. So going back to my notes here, the Duggars, the parents and the siblings. So Josh gave this public statement to people, and I'm guessing that given the savvy of the parents, they talked about exactly what to do in the situation and how to approach it. Now, they, I think, completely missed the mark. You could argue that Josh's statement actually is pretty good. Who knows how sincere it is, but as someone who now is specializing in apology videos and apology statements by various people, I've seen a lot worse than what Josh is saying here. So, there's that. But the parents really screwed things up. So they did an exclusive set of interviews with Megyn Kelly on Fox News. The parents did, and then there was another one with Jill and Jessa, who were two of the victims. I think that they might have been two of the oldest victims of Josh's abuse when they were younger. And it's interesting also just how popular Megyn Kelly was at the time, because I feel like she isn't the phenomenon that she was at the time. But anyway.
Well, Trump attacked her. She got relegated. So
yeah. So she was interviewing the parents, and I have some excerpts from the parents. And this is kind of the first view into the mindset of the parents, because we just don't have any data around how were they reacting, how did they see the situation, because there was a chance that they absolutely were responsible parents. And the other thing is by 2015, by the time this interview happens, they've had, I think it was 2002, so I think they've had 13 years to think and learn about how to approach this as parents. It's complicated, but the way they talk, it's like they hadn't advanced their thinking at all. And you just got to think like,
absolutely.
Well, where were they coming from originally? Because you would think they would have advanced a little bit, and they're putting on their best face for this interview because it's going to go out to the entire world.
This is their tour to make things better.
Right.
My main takeaway from watching those interviews, that stuff, was how little they seemed to regard the victims compared to Josh. So much about it was about imagining Josh in a better light, and like the family as a result. And the victims were like a second topic.
Right. Well, when you have a massively sexist society and you have an even more massively sexist cult, then
and that's their firstborn male child.
You just see the world differently.
Right. And like we said in a previous episode, they did have time with that first child because they didn't have 19 other children, and they were the direct parents. That is their baby.
Right.
It's their baby male, heir to the everything.
Yeah. Yeah,
but
heir to the everything.
Very telling.
I'm sure they had all sorts of machinations of that. Josh and Anna would have their own show, and they would have their own quiver full of kids that would have their shows, and they would be lobbyists in Washington, the whole thing. Anyway, so they disclosed that in this interview that the rumors about Josh were true, and that he had touched the younger girls when he was 15, all the way back in 2003. So it's a very long, disturbing video to watch if you want to get angry, not only at Jim Bob and Michelle Duggar, but at our society in some ways, at all the other parents that will make excuses for not only predators, sexual predators, but criminals in general. This interview will get you going. It is very disturbing listening to the parents. So the things that they said, and I'm summarizing and paraphrasing what they're saying, but they basically say that Josh's behavior was no big deal. That was their thesis. They were saying that the girls were too young to understand what happened.
Oh, right. Too young to remember.
Too young to understand digital penetration. And
has no effects.
Yeah, they're too young to get it. They also elaborated that the camp fixed him. This is the quote-unquote counseling or treatment that he went through. And from what we understand, the camp was basically a labor camp. Now, maybe there was some discussions, and maybe it did fix him. Maybe it was a wake-up call to him. Who knows? But they were saying he's all better now, but we know later that he was not all better, because he is presumably at this very moment in time in 2015 still downloading and consuming child pornography, participating in the trafficking of child pornography.
By the way, this is where I really, depart the shores of empathy, because for these parents, because I try to put myself in this situation. In one of the early episodes where you asked me, like, what would you do? And I said, I don't know. I guess I'll try to talk to a therapist or something. Even I don't really know what to do until you said, well, you can contact CPS and stuff. And I can empathize that a family wouldn't immediately go and try to get their kid thrown in jail and stuff. I get it. But I can imagine as a parent that if I were doing such an interview, even if I actually did an interview like that, because I probably would, what I would actually do is pull our family out of the limelight and go and try to deal with these problems privately, right? But let's say I was doing such an interview. I think 95% of my interview content would be about all the steps we've tried to take to try to heal our little victim children, and how horrible, and also 5% about the steps that we have also taken to try to heal our other abuser / victim child. But man.
Yeah. I often have that thought with public figures. Presumably they have teams of PR people that are paid a lot of money to advise them. And so often I find that these apology tours, if you will, or apology statements are so bad.
Yeah.
And it's just evidence to me. It's one of two things. Either they actually really do know what they're doing, but given my nature, their statements don't resonate with me, but they do resonate with the general public, because I can't really think of myself as being representative of the general public when it comes to apologizing, because some people will literally say, well, if they apologize, then they are guilty, and they didn't apologize, so that must mean they're not guilty. Though people have some pretty simplistic ideas, because they don't study this sort of stuff like I do. So it's either that, which I'd give that a 50% possibility. The other possibility, if they aren't actually winning the crowd over, and I don't think the parents won the crowd over at all. I don't even think they won Megyn Kelly over.
Do you think they resonated with their core audience at least?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, but they're what do we call their core audience? Because they, prior to this, had a very large, you could argue, core audience, but maybe not like brainwashed audience.
Oh, there's the TV show audience, which is massive.
Right.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking their community and their church and stuff.
I would guess that even their church and community was split, because when it came out that this letter that Kaylee had written,
right, that's true,
and it started to spread this very knowledge,
did split people. Yeah.
Right, there were some in the church that were saying that Kaylee's a gossip, and there were people saying like, what is going on with Josh?
Which is a good indication that maybe this kind of behavior isn't systemically pervasive in all the families in that community, right?
Yeah,
even
but
though there are institutionalized aspects that make it more possible. And
right.
Yeah.
So it just makes it more possible, but they're still a part of our society. They're not that different. But anyway, so if it isn't that they actually are a genius and I just don't see it, then I think what it represents is just the general lack of understanding and lack of wisdom regarding apologies in general in our society that I run into all the time. The average person, I've studied apologies. I professionally help people with apologies for the past 25 plus years in my office. I learned early on in my career as a couples therapist that I had this intuition often, maybe even every session with every couple that I would, especially in the beginning phases of therapy, which can last like a few years, that I would say, because I would hear each person in the marriage talking about the other person, complaining about them. Oh, and then he did this and I couldn't believe it. And, they'd be fighting. And the surface talk would be around that you're wrong. You did this to me and you shouldn't have done that. You dropped the ball. You didn't care about my feelings, that kind of stuff, which is good, but it's not representative of what I was intuiting, which was that the individual wanted an apology. Because the way that it seems like when you're being chastised or criticized by your partner, it feels like you're just being chastised. It feels like, and you'll often hear people in couples, they'll say like, well, what do you want me to do? Like get down on my knees and beg for forgiveness or something? Because it has that tone, because people are afraid of showing their vulnerable side or making any sort of request because they're hurt and they're scared. And so it's just a lot of anger and a lot of criticism and a lot of that kind of thing. And so because I'm actually trying to help these people, I try to intuit or discover what the person is really trying to say but too afraid to. And I would intuit often that I would say, well, it sounds like you want an apology from your partner. Yeah. Is that true? And it would really shift things from the criticism and the anger to this possibility. And then it's a roadmap forward for the transgressor to actually repair things. Because prior to that, there's no road forward. The transgressor is just being chastised and yelled at. Now there's a road, because both people want to repair, but without that roadmap, then it just escalates from there, and then they end up getting divorced, kind of thing.
It's really interesting that we as humans are actually really good, I think, about picking up subtle little things. For example, if someone is apologizing to you in a bad way, we intuit, even though we might not recognize it, that it's not a real apology. So if someone's like, well, I'm sorry, right? We already
or I'm sorry you feel that way.
Sorry you feel that way. We already caught it. But then our reaction, it's unfortunate that our reaction isn't nuanced and informed enough to be like, well, actually, here's how that makes me feel. Instead, it's like more chastising or more whatever. I've certainly been both recipient and disher of those kinds of things.
Yeah, me too. It's apparently human nature, which is really unfortunate. There's so many things that can be solved, not only marriages, but between nations, between political divides, at work, between children and parents. So many things can be repaired so quickly if people were aware and more practiced at truly apologizing. And a part of truly apologizing is not just the words, but getting in touch with yourself and actually knowing what you feel. You got to identify with the remorse. And how do you identify with the remorse? Well, you have to have compassion. How do you have compassion? You have to understand how to investigate how other people feel. You might commit a transgression and be confused as to why your partner's upset at you. There's a pathway to figuring that out. And the other thing is, even if I know all these things and I actually enact these things and try to investigate, the other person has to have awareness enough to know how to play into that. A prime example is me and my friends were annoying people that were near us in public. And I didn't know that we were annoying them. I didn't even know that they were there. And then when, after an hour or something, they alerted us to it. They said, like, you're being annoying in this way. And I immediately realized that it would be very annoying if they were sitting right next to us. And I didn't think about it. And I immediately felt remorse. And so I immediately said, oh my God, I'm so sorry that you had to deal with it. I mean, it wasn't the end of the world. It wasn't life altering how annoyed, but you could imagine it would just be a little irritating to have to sit there. And I immediately apologized, said, oh my God, I'm so sorry. And then they laid into me more and they thought I was being sarcastic. And I said, no, I'm not being, I'm truly telling you that I get it. Like, I can't imagine how.
And it's so weird for them to hear that. They're like, okay, this guy's trying to be a dick.
Right. So I can do everything right, but the other person can do everything wrong and it still won't work. There's so many things that need to happen and people are just miserable at this. So I think that's why so many of these public statements are so bad. I mean, Will Smith had how many months
to prepare?
And that he had a team.
Right.
He probably spent, no joke, like $2 million. This was his career on the line. He could have spent $2 to $10 million on a team to figure out what to do. His public apology was terrible. I mean, it was in the direction, but if I had told him, but that's the other thing. It's like, well, there's another 50% that says, if you do what I do, maybe it's too over the top and people disregard that in some way. I don't know.
Doesn't it feel like, and I don't know if maybe Chris Rock wouldn't have played along with it, but to me, the thing would have been to have Chris Rock in front of you and say to him how terribly, deeply sorry, and that the whole thing needs to end with hugging it out and apologizing to him first and then apologizing to the bad examples or something like this. But anyways, I hear you. Apologies are hard for people. Well, they're hard to receive. They're hard to give.
In a nutshell, and I did a whole reaction video to it, but in a nutshell, what I would have said if I was Will Smith is something along the lines of, I have issues. I've written about him in my book. I was bullied by my dad. My dad was a monster. He was, domestic violence. He was... he abused my mom. I had to witness that, and I hated watching that. And when I heard Chris Rock making fun of my wife, it just triggered something in me. And I've been triggered in a variety of ways like that before, but I never did something like this. I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe it was also part of, because I was wondering if I was going to win an Oscar, and I was really nervous about what I was going to say. And I took a Xanax before I went because I get nervous in situations like that, and so I wasn't quite myself. That's not an excuse, but I'm just saying that I have issues and I've been working on it, apparently not well enough by that point. And when I did that, the next day I was so ashamed. Something like that. Like It could have been 10% of what I just did, but he didn't do anything like that. He says, I take full responsibility for what I did. And it's like, well, you can say that, but are you? Because it didn't really sound like he was taking full responsibility.
Even just looking at, even if Chris Rock isn't there, just looking at the camera and saying, Chris, I have issues. I took it out on you unfairly. I am so sorry. I'm so deeply sorry.
That's better than his entire video. Yeah.
Now, by the way, that time that you were talking about, part of the reason they didn't buy your apologies because I kept throwing orange peels at them, but
Thank you. So they go on with their statement. So they say the girls are too young to understand. They say the camp fixed him. They say that they had forgiven him. They said that they had rules in place so that Josh couldn't play hide and seek without supervision. Okay. From my experience, given the way that they talked about the measures they took to protect the younger kids from Josh, it was not sufficient. If you have someone that is motivated to abuse the younger girls, he snuck into their room while they were sleeping often.
Yeah.
So unless there were locks on the door or something, which I doubt that there were, then there was ample opportunity for Josh to continue abusing the younger girls, from what I can tell.
Isn't that also hyper specific too? Like, doesn't that tell you a lot of information? Like, oh, he's not allowed to play hide and seek. Well, wait a minute. Let's talk about that a little bit. What do you know about hide and seek that happened?
Right.
And why that specifically?
Right. And from at least the reporting, none of the abuses happened during hide and seek.
Right.
So,
to me, that tells me either that they're just like, what can we say that will sound like we're doing? Oh, he can't play hide and seek.
Yeah, there's that. And there's also a possibility that because of their lack of education around this and sophistication, which is normal in our society, then they literally believe this is a slam dunk defense. You know what I mean? I wouldn't be surprised. They also said that Josh was right by God now, so that makes everything okay. I'm paraphrasing, of course. They said that they're being attacked. So there was a big attack in 2015 because In Touch magazine publicized this police report. And they were potentially losing all their fame and their TV show. And so they spent a lot of time in the interview, if you remember, talking about how the attacks had nothing to do with Josh or the other or the victims, but had everything to do with the fact that they're Christians. They were being attacked by the secular liberal media, which is presumably why they were talking to Megyn Kelly on Fox News to begin with, because they potentially felt more safe there or something. And I will say that Megyn Kelly did really let him off the hook, because you watched the interview too. She had some integrity and she seemed to ask some good questions. Maybe not as much as we would hope, but
but it wasn't a total softball.
She wasn't letting him off the hook, that kind of thing. But this is evidence of another aspect of cults, and particularly around Christian cults, I guess, where they will say that any attack from the outside is just because they're the devil people or the secular people or the unaware people. And what that does is that basically allows the cult power structure to disregard any criticism that is waged against them, and thus they retain their power over the people that, most cults need to have control over a group of people. Sometimes it's one person over everyone, or it's all the men over all the women, that sort of thing. And when you accept that the outside world has any kind of validity, then you open yourself up to losing that power, and then you have an elaborate structure that will uphold the notions so that all the cult members will continue to believe that the secular liberal media is lying and devilish and out to get you.
By the way, the other insidious part there is the Josh is right by God now. So one of the most dangerous things, I think, in our history as humans, are humans claiming to have directly spoken to a deity and therefore being able to tell you what to do or who to kill or what. Here's the religion I would like and would be okay being a part of, is that where they're like, hey, we don't know, but it seems like we look around, it seems to us like maybe someone made all this and maybe they want us to be good people to it and to us. So we believe that. We don't know. We're not having weird conversations with them. And so here's our rules we're going to write down because we believe this. I'm like, okay, that sounds good. Let's all be great to our environment and each other. I love it. But as soon as it's like, hey, last night I talked to that deity I mentioned the other day, and here's what they told me, I'm like, okay, I'm out. Right. And so when they can say, oh, we talked to our priest or God directly or whatever, and Josh is cool now. It's like, yeah, no, that's not okay. It doesn't work that way.
Right. Because all those involved, particularly parents, have motivated reasoning that will motivate them to distort the situation because they want it to be that way. So therefore, I want God to believe this, therefore God does believe this.
Like, do we imagine there was a conversation they could have had where, well, actually, Megan, to tell you the truth, we had a conversation with God, and apparently Josh is going to hell still.
Yeah. So now, like I said, is it possible that Josh had done a lot to earn respect and trust from his family? There's some evidence that that could be true. It's also quite possible that he didn't abuse any people after that, aside from the child pornography, which is atrocious, but no direct contact. We don't know. He seemingly voluntarily would bring it up with people. He was apparently the first person that alerted. The victims didn't come forward. He was the one that came forward. So, it's possible. But even if all that were true, if it were you or I in this situation, we would be saying different sorts of things.
That's right.
We'd be saying, well, first off, I understand why everyone is upset because we've been promoting this kid of ours. But if you knew what was going on behind the scenes, you would just kind of know the full story. But I understand why people wouldn't know. The other thing I'll say is that we were kind of lost in the dark and we didn't really know what to do. And we reached out to people, and looking back, we should have done more. We should have had more rules, but we just didn't know at the time. We thought that, we were used to believing our kids, and we've learned now that that's not the way you're supposed to do things. And I lie awake at night worrying that he did other things to the girls. But I lie awake at night anyway because of what we do know that he did to the girls. And the girls seem okay, but I've been told that we just don't really know. And I'm trying to open up the possibility for the girls to be able to tell us if they're suffering in any way. And, they're all in therapy and this sort of thing. But I don't know.
Right. So like admitting wrongs, admitting that you're trying to do something about it, that the victims are important to you.
There's a way forward, even given what they did, There's a way to just say the way that I said, and I was just thinking of it off the top of my head based on what I think I know what they were going through. Just admit that you didn't know what you were doing.
Yeah.
And say that you regret it and that you worry about it and you center the victims in the narrative.
Minimizing it is almost like they could have just come out and said, well, what were we supposed to do? Think about how much money is involved here.
Right. Now, another motivation here is they might even think literally God wants them to obscure the matter because if they don't, they'll lose their quiverful ability.
And the bigger cause and blah, blah, blah.
Right. Who knows? But
ends justify the means.
Yeah. Also, in the evangelical world, there's a long tradition of, what do they call it? You repent.
Yeah, absolution and repent.
There's a word for it. But anyway.
Penitence.
There's another word for it I can't think about. But the point is that it's very normal for someone to come up in front of the church, maybe even the minister themselves, and say, I have sinned. I did the following thing. I cheated on my wife, for example.
Yeah, like confession is built into Catholic Church.
Right, but that's in the behind closed doors.
Sure.
And it's more penitence oriented, but at least from my stereotypical understanding of Catholics. But with evangelicals, it's almost part of the furthering of your spiritual being is to recognize your sinning nature and to publicly declare it and hand yourself over to God and to your congregation. And through that, you're forgiven, and the prodigal son sort of thing, and the washing away of the sins. In some ways, culturally speaking, you're more pure and more clean after you do something like that, especially if you publicly state these sort of things to your congregation and hand yourself over and provide an example. It also can be very inspirational, for someone to stand up and say, I've been drinking, I've been sexually inappropriate.
Right, but here's what's not inspirational. Hey, congregation, so I've been drinking, which is no big deal, by the way. And I, inappropriately touched, which, by the way, they deserved, and they were asking for it, and it's not a big deal. But anyways, I'm repenting.
Right. So there's two versions that I'll say, at either end of the spectrum. On one end is where it isn't legitimate and there are actually leaked videos. Like there's this one video I saw of this one minister who admitted and was coming clean about, I think, abusing a teenage girl, something like that. And the way he's talking about it, he's basically just saying, I asked God for forgiveness. I ask you for forgiveness. And the congregation forgives him. And then it's just like, it's over.
Okay, good. We talked about that. Next topic.
What about the victim? That kind of thing. So can it be that version? Yeah. But it also could be a more legitimate version where the person is legitimately remorseful and feels bad. Now, maybe the premise of their shame is actually based on some weird interpretation of the Bible, like I masturbated or something, and you're this horrific person.
My point is that it didn't sound from the interview like it was the good version. Like it was like things happen, but it wasn't that big a deal.
Well, and if it was, which I still allow, again, I'm not saying it was, but I'm saying it's possible. If it was the good version, they certainly didn't make a good case for it the way they were talking about it. And the way they were talking about it, if this is the best they can do, then there's a good chance that they were actively sweeping it under the rug and not really emphasizing the victims. And the fact that they even were encouraging, and we don't really know because we'll get to Jill and Jess's part of the interview, but the fact that they would, parade the victims in front of the camera and presumably had conversations with the victims about what they're going to say, or at least subtly, and put them in that position where they have to defend their abuser.
Yeah.
Is that's maybe the worst thing we could point to in this entire thing. Anyway, so they also said in the interview that Josh isn't a pedophile because he's not 16. So they literally said this. Okay, so they're like, look, Josh isn't a pedophile because he wasn't 16 at the time of the transgressions. He's just a kid who did something to another kid. So what do you think about that? Well, actually, Berto, let's take a break, and the rest of this video and episode will just be for patrons of the podcast.
Okay.
Because there is some actual truth-ish to what the parents are saying.
Oh, interesting.
Which I imagine you don't know about, but anyway, because why would you? But so if you want to listen to that bit and all the rest of, we're going to go into Jill and Jess's interview, and there's a lot of quotes that I have, and then of course there's other transgressions that Josh continues that come to light soon after this. So become a patron of the podcast to hear the rest of this. And otherwise, please take care of yourself because
you deserve it.